The scream cut through the frozen morning like a blade. Not loud, not dramatic, just broken. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for help, because it already knows help might not come. Daisy froze where she stood. Her massive white body went still, her breath catching in her chest as the cry echoed again from somewhere deep inside the rescue center. To anyone else, it was just another distressed animal. But to Daisy, it was something far worse. She had made that sound once, years ago, alone, abandoned, left behind in the cold, calling for people who never came back. The cry came again, this time weaker, thinner, like it was running out of hope. Daisy took one slow step toward the sound, then stopped. Because whatever was crying didn't just need help. It needed a mother. And Daisy had no idea that answering that call would change her life forever, or that loving what she was about to meet would eventually force her to face the most painful goodbye she had ever known. Stay with us, because what happens next shouldn't be possible. The morning at Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center began the way it always did. Quiet, measured, wrapped in the soft hush of mist drifting down from the mountains. Frost clung to the wooden railings, and the first pale light of dawn crept across the gravel paths between the enclosures. Most of the animals were still sleeping, tucked into their shelters, breathing in slow, steady rhythms. It was the kind of morning that felt safe, predictable, kind. Then the sound came. It cut through the silence like something torn open. Daisy lifted her head instantly. The cry echoed from the quarantine wing on the far side of the property, sharp and broken, carrying a desperation that didn't belong to the morning. It wasn't loud, but it was raw, thin, strained and aching with fear. Daisy's massive white body went rigid. Her ears tilted forward, every muscle locking into place as if the sound itself had reached inside her and grabbed hold of something fragile. She knew that sound. Not because she had heard it before from another animal, but because she had once made it herself. 4 years earlier, Daisy had stood trembling beside an abandoned gas station just outside Boone, North Carolina. Snow had blown sideways in sheets, stinging her eyes and packing into her fur. Her leash had been tied to a rusted metal post, cinched so tight it burned her neck when she tried to move. She had cried then too. Long, pleading sounds sent after the car she believed would come back for her. She had watched the red taillights disappear into the storm, her voice growing hoarse with each unanswered call. That was the sound she was hearing now. Daisy rose slowly to her feet, her paws crunching softly against the frozen ground. She was a Great Pyrenees, enormous and unmistakable, her thick white coat catching the early light like fresh snow. At nearly 140 pounds, she looked imposing to strangers, but the people who knew her well understood the truth. Daisy carried her strength gently, as though she was always afraid of breaking something fragile, including herself. She took a step toward the sound, then stopped. Her chest tightened. The cry came again, followed by another, weaker and thinner, as if the first voice had been joined by others. Daisy's tail, usually swaying in an easy rhythm, hung motionless behind her. Her breath came faster now, shallow and uneven. Across the yard, Dr. Emily Carter pushed open the door of the main clinic, a clipboard tucked under one arm. She paused when she heard the noise, her brow furrowing. Emily had spent most of her life learning to recognize distress calls, foxes, raccoons, injured hawks, but this one stopped her cold. It carried a pitch that spoke of separation, not pain, of fear, not injury. "Noah," she called, already turning toward the quarantine wing. Noah Brooks, the newest rescue technician at the center, jogged up beside her, camera slung over his shoulder out of habit more than intention. "I hear it," he said quietly. "It doesn't sound good." They didn't notice Daisy at first. She stood frozen near the edge of the path, her dark eyes fixed on the distant building as if the walls themselves were calling her by name. Another cry rang out, shorter this time, more frantic. Daisy let out a low whine before she could stop herself. The sound surprised her, escaping from somewhere deep in her chest, old and instinctive. Emily turned sharply. Daisy! She had never seen the dog like this. Daisy was the calm center of the rescue, the quiet presence that seemed to ease frightened animals simply by lying nearby. She had helped traumatized dogs take their first steps out of fear, had sat patiently beside injured fawns during examinations, had once slept outside an enclosure for 2 nights straight because a rescued fox kit wouldn't stop pacing unless Daisy was near. But this was different. Daisy wasn't offering comfort. She was reacting to something personal. Another cry echoed, followed by a thin, wavering sound that broke off abruptly, as if the voice behind it had run out of strength. Daisy's legs trembled. She took a few unsteady steps forward, then stopped again, as if unsure whether she was allowed to move closer to whatever pain was calling her. Emily lowered her voice without realizing it. "Easy, girl," she murmured, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to calm, Daisy or herself. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of unfamiliar animals toward them, wild, young, afraid. Daisy's nose twitched, her eyes never leaving the quarantine building. The cries were closer now, bouncing off the trees, threading themselves through her memories until past and present blurred together. She remembered the cold, the confusion, the way hope had hurt worse than fear when the car never came back. And she understood, with a clarity that took her breath away, that whatever was crying in that building was feeling the same thing. If you're still with us, you're part of a remarkable community here at Whispering Hearts, where real stories of extraordinary animal connections come to life. Every subscriber helps us share more heart-touching moments that reveal the power of compassion across species. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because the journey ahead is one you'll feel long after the story ends. Daisy took another step forward. This time, she didn't stop. Her paws carried her down the path, slow but deliberate, as if each movement required permission from a part of her that was still afraid. Emily watched her go, a strange unease settling in her chest. Daisy had never approached the quarantine wing on her own before. She avoided it, the way some survivors avoid places that smell too much like their past. Until now. The cries rose again, overlapping, tangled together in desperate harmony. Daisy's ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. Whatever waited behind those walls was not just another rescue case. It was a call, and Daisy was answering it. She reached the window of the quarantine building and stood there, her breath fogging the glass as she pressed her nose close. Inside, shadows moved quickly. Emily and Noah followed at a distance, their footsteps quiet, their voices gone. For a long moment, Daisy simply stood there, listening. Then, from deep in her chest, she released a sound so soft it barely carried, a low, steady hum, instinctive and untrained, shaped by memory and need. It wasn't meant for humans. It was meant for someone who was alone. Inside the building, the crying faltered, and in that fragile pause, something unseen shifted, setting into motion a bond that would change every life it touched. Dr. Emily Carter reached the quarantine wing first, her boots skidding slightly on the thin layer of frost as she pulled the heavy door open. Warm air rushed out to meet the cold morning, carrying with it the sharp, unmistakable scent of wild animals under stress. The cries were louder in here, no longer distant or echoing, but close enough to feel, vibrating in the chest rather than the ears. Emily had learned long ago that there were different kinds of animal sounds. Pain had its own pitch, hunger had another, but this was something else entirely. This was fear layered with loss, confusion wrapped around the absence of something essential. 3 intakes, Noah said softly as he followed her in, his usual easy confidence gone. They came in less than an hour ago. Emily nodded, already moving toward the far end of the room where 3 transport crates sat under heat lamps. Each crate was spaced a few feet apart, standard procedure meant to reduce stress. In theory. In reality, the separation seemed to be making everything worse. The first crate rattled as something small and frantic threw itself against the wire door. A tiny face pressed forward, eyes wide and glassy, mouth open in a cry that sounded too big for such a small body. Emily felt her throat tighten. "That's Ranger," Noah said quietly. "Male. Strong lungs. He hasn't stopped since they arrived." Emily crouched beside the crate, careful to keep her movements slow. Ranger was barely 6 weeks old, all oversized ears and spotted gray fur, his paws still clumsy with youth. He stood on his hind legs, claws hooked into the mesh, calling out with everything he had, as if sheer volume could bring his mother back. In the second crate, another bobcat kitten had wedged himself into the farthest corner, his body curled tight and trembling. His cries were smaller, broken, almost apologetic. He didn't look up when Emily approached. "That one's Ash," Noah murmured. "He freezes instead of fighting." Emily shifted her attention to the third crate, and her breath caught. The smallest kitten lay on her side, her thin chest rising and falling unevenly. Her mouth opened now and then, but the sound that came out was faint, more breath than voice. "And Piper?" Emily asked, though she already knew. Noah swallowed. "She's weak, dehydrated. The stress isn't helping." Emily reached through the crate door just far enough to slide a thermometer beneath Piper's belly. The number on the screen dropped faster than she liked. Too fast. Piper wasn't just scared, she was shutting down. "We need to calm them," Emily said, more to herself than to Noah. Especially her. Another wail from Ranger cut through the room, sharp enough to make Piper flinch weakly. Ash's small cries picked up in response, the 3 voices tangling together in a rising wave of panic. Emily felt a familiar frustration twist in her chest. She had treated broken bones, stitched deep wounds, brought animals back from the edge of death. But grief was harder. You couldn't medicate grief away. Behind her, the door creaked softly. Emily turned, expecting Noah to have stepped out. Instead, she saw Daisy standing just inside the doorway. The dog filled the frame completely, her broad shoulders and thick white coat almost glowing under the fluorescent lights. She didn't move forward. She didn't bark. She simply stood there, her dark eyes fixed on the crates as if she could see straight through them. Ranger's cry faltered. It wasn't sudden. It was as if the sound lost its footing mid-air, stumbling into silence. Ranger froze, his head cocked slightly, ears twitching. Ash lifted his face from the corner for the first time, blinking through his fear. Even Piper stirred, her head shifting weakly as her nose twitched. Emily stared. "I didn't call her in," Noah whispered, awe creeping into his voice. "She followed us." Daisy took one slow step forward, then another, her movements careful, almost reverent. She stopped several feet from the crates and sat down, her large body settling with a quiet huff. Her posture was low and non-threatening, her head slightly bowed as though she understood she was a guest in a fragile space. From deep in her chest came that same soft hum Emily had heard outside. Steady, rhythmic, impossible to mistake for anything else. It wasn't a sound Emily had ever learned to interpret in veterinary school. It wasn't scientific, but it was undeniably intentional. Ranger's paws slipped from the crate door. He dropped back onto all fours, his mouth still open, but the cry never came. Instead, a questioning sound escaped him, small, uncertain, curious. Ash inched forward from the corner, his trembling easing just enough for him to sit up. Piper's breathing slowed, her tiny body no longer fighting against itself. Emily felt her heart begin to pound. "This shouldn't be working," she murmured. But it was. Daisy didn't approach the crates. She didn't try to touch. She simply stayed where she was, eyes soft, body warm and solid and present. The room seemed to breathe with her, the tension loosening in small, fragile increments. For the first time since the Bobcats had arrived, the cries stopped completely. Emily straightened slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell. She glanced at Noah, whose eyes were shining. "She knows," he whispered. "I don't know how, but she knows." Emily looked back at Daisy. The dog met her gaze for a brief moment, something deep and unmistakable passing between them. This wasn't training. It wasn't coincidence. This was recognition. Emily felt the weight of the decision settling onto her shoulders, even as she tried to push it away. She had rules to follow, protocols, entire textbooks warning against exactly this kind of situation. But standing in that quiet room, surrounded by 3 terrified lives that had finally found stillness, those rules felt suddenly fragile. And Daisy, once abandoned, once voiceless in her own fear, sat calmly among them as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Emily exhaled slowly. Whatever was happening here, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. These 3 small lives had been heard. And Daisy was the one listening. The silence that settled over the quarantine room felt fragile, as if it might shatter with the slightest wrong move. Dr. Emily Carter stood perfectly still, her breath shallow, her eyes moving from Daisy to the 3 crates and back again. In 15 years of wildlife medicine, she had learned to trust patterns, data, cause and effect. What she was witnessing now fit none of those things, and yet it was impossible to deny. Ranger sat quietly on his haunches, his sides rising and falling in slower, steadier breaths. Ash had crept closer to the front of his crate, his body no longer locked in on itself. Piper's chest moved with more rhythm than it had minutes earlier, the tremor in her tiny frame easing just enough to matter. Emily glanced down at the thermometer still resting in her hand. Piper's temperature had stabilized, but just barely. "She's still too cold," Emily said under her breath. "If her stress spikes again, we're going to lose ground fast." As if responding to the tension in Emily's voice, Piper let out a faint, wavering sound. It was barely audible, more a thread of breath than a cry, but Daisy's head lifted instantly, her dark eyes locked onto the smallest crate, her entire posture shifting with quiet urgency. Emily felt the room tilt. Daisy took one slow step forward. Emily's instincts flared all at once. Every guideline she had ever followed pressed against her chest. Wild animals were not to be imprinted on domestic ones. Dogs, no matter how gentle, were not to be placed inside active quarantine spaces without clear necessity. This wasn't just policy. It was protection for everyone involved. But necessity had a way of redefining itself. Another thin sound slipped from Piper's mouth, followed by a sharp intake of breath that ended in a small cough. Ranger reacted immediately, his body tensing, his mouth opening as if to cry again. The fragile calm wavered. Emily looked at Noah. "Get ready to intervene," she said quietly. "If I say stop, you stop me." Noah nodded, his face pale but determined. Emily turned back to Daisy. "Easy, girl," she whispered, though her voice shook despite her best efforts. "Just a little closer." Daisy seemed to understand not just the words, but the weight behind them. She moved forward with deliberate care, each step placed softly on the rubberized floor. She lowered her head as she approached the crates, her massive body curving inward, shrinking herself as much as a dog her size possibly could. She stopped a few feet away. The effect was immediate. Ranger's half-formed cry dissolved into silence. His ears twitched forward, his wide eyes fixed on Daisy's face. Ash sat up straighter, his trembling subsiding into cautious stillness. Piper's breathing slowed, her chest no longer fighting against fear with every rise. Daisy lay down. She folded herself onto the floor in a slow, careful motion, her body creating a broad, white presence that felt less like an animal and more like a barrier, warm, steady, unmovable. She positioned herself so that all 3 crates were directly within her line of sight, as if she were keeping watch. Then she made the sound again. That low, steady hum vibrated softly through the room, deep and rhythmic, resonating from her chest rather than her throat. It wasn't loud enough to echo, but it didn't need to be. The sound seemed to fill the space anyway, wrapping around the crates like an invisible blanket. Emily felt her eyes sting. "I don't understand this," she murmured. Noah swallowed. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Just look." Ranger stepped closer to the front of his crate, his small paws pressing against the mesh. He didn't cry. He didn't thrash. He simply stared at Daisy, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle, far bigger than his young mind. Ash crept forward beside him, their bodies almost touching through the barrier. Piper shifted again, her head lifting weakly before settling into a more comfortable position. Emily moved closer, crouching beside Piper's crate. She checked the thermometer again. The number was holding, still low, but no longer falling. "That's enough," Emily whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. 30 seconds. That was all the time she gave herself to decide. If this went wrong, she would carry the responsibility alone. But if she did nothing, if she pulled Daisy away and watched Piper slip further into shock, she would never forgive herself. "Daisy," Emily said softly, her voice thick, "stay right there." Daisy didn't move. Emily reached for Piper's crate and carefully slid the door open just a few inches, enough to adjust the heat source inside, enough to risk a surge of panic if Piper startled. Ranger reacted instantly, a sharp cry ripping from his throat as the metal door shifted. Piper stiffened. Before the sound could escalate, Daisy responded. She lifted her head and leaned forward just slightly, her nose hovering inches from the open crate. Her hum deepened, becoming slower, steadier, more insistent. Her warm breath flowed into the crate, carrying her scent, clean, familiar, grounding. Ranger's cry broke off mid-sound. Ash froze, then relaxed. Piper exhaled. Emily held her breath as she finished the adjustment, then slowly slid the crate door closed again. She sat back on her heels, heart hammering in her chest. The room was quiet. Not the tense quiet of held fear, but something softer, something closer to peace. Emily looked up at Daisy, her voice barely audible. "I've never seen anything like this." Daisy met her gaze for a long moment. There was no excitement in her expression, no triumph, just focus, commitment, the quiet determination of someone who understood exactly what was being asked of her. "She's not calming them," Noah said slowly. "She's anchoring them." Emily nodded, the truth of it settling deep in her bones. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was a choice made by a dog who understood abandonment in a way no textbook ever could. Emily rose to her feet, her decision firming with every steady breath Piper took. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll let her stay. For now." Noah's eyes widened. "You're sure?" Emily didn't hesitate. "For now," she repeated, "because whatever comes next, they're not facing it alone." Daisy lowered her head again, her hum resuming its gentle rhythm. 3 small lives pressed closer to the sound, drawn toward the only thing that had made the world feel safe again. And in that quiet room, with frost still clinging to the windows and the mountains standing watch outside, something irreversible took root. A bond had formed, and none of them yet understood how far it would carry them. By late afternoon, the quarantine room no longer felt like a place of emergency. The sharp edge of panic had dulled into something quieter, almost tender. The overhead lights were dimmed, the hum of the heaters steady and low. Dr. Emily Carter moved carefully now, as if she were walking through a room where someone had just fallen asleep. Daisy had not moved from her spot on the floor. She lay on her side a few feet from the crates, her massive white body forming a soft arc that seemed to enclose them without touching. Her head rested between her paws, eyes half-lidded but alert, tracking every small movement inside the wire enclosures. The gentle humming sound continued, rising and falling with her breathing, never forced, never stopping. Ranger was the first to test the space between them. He stepped forward until his nose nearly touched the mesh, his ears flicking as he studied Daisy's face. His cries were gone now, replaced by small, curious sounds, questioning chirps that rose and fell uncertainly. Daisy did not move toward him. She simply remained where she was, steady and unthreatening, letting him decide the distance. Ash followed more cautiously, inching forward until he was beside his brother. His body still carried tension, but it no longer shook. Piper shifted in her crate as well, her tiny body stretching out instead of curling inward, her breathing even enough that Emily felt her shoulders finally relax. Emily watched it all from the far wall, clipboard forgotten at her side. "She's doing exactly what a mother would do," she murmured to Noah. "Not crowding, not forcing, just being there." Noah nodded slowly, and they're responding like babies who found one. As evening settled over the center, the temperature outside dropped sharply. Frost thickened on the windows, blurring the outlines of the trees beyond. Inside, the quarantine room remained warm, but the light changed, stretching shadows long across the floor. Emily prepared to leave for the night, confident that the heaters and monitors were stable. The moment she reached for the door, Ranger cried out. It wasn't the raw scream from earlier. This sound was sharper, urgent, laced with panic. Ash joined in immediately, his smaller voice climbing quickly. Piper's breath hitched, her body stiffening. Emily froze. Daisy rose to her feet in one smooth motion and stepped closer to the crates, placing herself directly between them and the door. Her posture wasn't aggressive. There was no growl, no baring of teeth, but the message was unmistakable. "Don't leave." Emily felt something twist deep in her chest. She took a step back into the room. The cries eased, then faded completely as Daisy settled down again, her humming resuming as if nothing had happened. Ranger pressed himself against the front of the crate, his small body relaxing. Ash sat down beside him. Piper let out a soft breath and went still. Emily closed her eyes briefly. "They're anchoring to her," she said quietly. "If we keep separating them, we're going to keep triggering that response." Noah hesitated. "So what do we do?" Emily didn't answer right away. She stared at Daisy, at the way the dog had positioned herself instinctively, creating a living boundary between fear and safety. Emily had seen maternal behavior before, countless times, across countless species. But this was different. This wasn't instinct driven by biology. This was choice. "Tonight," Emily said slowly, "we stay." They pulled a chair into the corner of the room. Emily checked the monitors every half hour, but nothing spiked. Piper's temperature crept upward by fractions of a degree. Ranger and Ash curled together, their bodies pressed close to the mesh, their small heads angled toward Daisy as if drawn by gravity. At some point past midnight, Ranger lifted one tiny paw and pushed it through the crate opening, his claws barely visible. He stretched as far as he could reach, the gesture hesitant, almost shy. Daisy noticed immediately. She leaned forward just enough that her warm nose brushed against Ranger's paw. The contact was feather-light, brief, but it changed everything. Ranger didn't pull back. Instead, he pressed his paw more firmly against her nose and released a sound so small and soft it was almost lost in the quiet. A purr, more vibration than noise. Daisy's breath caught. Her tail began to move, slow and gentle, sweeping the floor in a steady rhythm. The humming deepened, lowering into something richer, fuller, as if her chest had found a new purpose. Her eyes glistened in the low light, her focus absolute. Emily turned away, wiping at her face before she realized tears had formed. By morning, the arrangement felt inevitable. The crates were moved closer together, then carefully repositioned near a thick dog bed brought in from the main building. Daisy lay beside it without being asked, her body forming a protective curve that felt deliberate, intentional. Every time Emily or Noah adjusted equipment or checked vitals, Daisy watched closely, not interfering but present, alert, ready. "She's learning their needs," Noah whispered. "Look at her." And he was right. Daisy responded differently to each kitten. When Ranger grew restless, she lifted her head and met his gaze, grounding his energy. When Ash retreated into himself, Daisy lowered her head, her presence softer, quieter. When Piper stirred weakly, Daisy shifted closer, her warmth radiating outward, steady and reassuring. Emily documented everything, her notes growing longer, more careful. She wrote about stress responses and behavioral stabilization, about untrained interspecies calming effects. But between the lines, she wrote something else, something no report could fully capture. Daisy was no longer just helping. She was mothering. As the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains, pale light spilling into the room, Emily stood by the window and watched Daisy rest her head gently on the edge of the dog bed. 3 small bobcat kittens slept peacefully nearby, their bodies finally loose with trust. Emily understood then that whatever rules might be challenged in the days ahead, whatever questions would be asked, there was no turning back. A line had been crossed, not recklessly, but reverently. Daisy had opened her heart, and 3 tiny lives had stepped inside. The peace that settled over the quarantine room did not last long. It never does. By mid-morning, word had spread quietly through the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center. Staff members passed the doorway more often than usual, pausing just long enough to glimpse the impossible sight inside. 3 bobcat kittens sleeping soundly while a giant white dog kept watch nearby. Some smiled, others frowned, worry tightening their faces. Dr. Emily Carter knew what was coming before it arrived. She was in her office reviewing Piper's latest vitals when the sound of tires on gravel reached her ears. Not the familiar crunch of staff vehicles, but something heavier, deliberate, official. Emily looked up just as Noah appeared in the doorway, his expression tight. "Emily," he said quietly, "we've got a visitor." She closed the folder slowly. "Let me guess." "Officer Grant Miller," Noah replied. "State Wildlife Compliance." Emily exhaled through her nose and stood. "All right," she said. "Let's do this properly." Officer Miller was waiting near the front of the quarantine wing when Emily arrived. He was a tall man in his early 50s, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid with authority. Years in the field had given him a sharp eye and a habit of forming opinions quickly. He held a clipboard under one arm, his expression neutral but alert. "Dr. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "I appreciate you seeing me on short notice." "Of course," Emily replied, shaking it firmly. "What can I help you with?" Miller glanced past her toward the quarantine room. "We received a report this morning," he said. "Concern about potential protocol violations involving a domestic animal and wildlife under your care." Emily didn't flinch. "I see. I'd like to observe," Miller said. It wasn't a request. Emily nodded once. "Follow me." The walk down the hall felt longer than usual. Emily was acutely aware of every step, every sound. When she opened the quarantine room door, the warmth and quiet washed over them. Daisy lifted her head immediately, her eyes tracking the unfamiliar man with calm intensity. She did not rise. She did not growl. She simply watched. The kittens stirred. Ranger raised his head first, ears pricking, Ash pressed closer to the dog bed, his small body angling instinctively toward Daisy. Piper shifted weakly, releasing a faint sound that barely carried. Daisy responded at once, her hum beginning again, soft, steady, grounding. Officer Miller stopped, just inside the room. He stared. For a long moment, no one spoke. "That's unusual," Miller said finally. Emily folded her hands in front of her. "It's temporary," she said carefully. "The dog is providing stress reduction support while we stabilize the kittens." Miller's brow furrowed. "Dogs are not approved calming agents for wild felids." "No," Emily agreed. "They aren't. But neither are sedatives for neonates with compromised systems. We're doing what's medically necessary." Miller stepped closer, his gaze moving from Daisy to the crates and back again. "This kind of contact risks imprinting," he said. "It can compromise their ability to return to the wild." Before Emily could respond, Ranger let out a sharp cry. Miller startled slightly as the sound echoed off the walls. Ash followed immediately, his small voice tight with panic. Piper's breathing quickened, her body stiffening. Emily's heart dropped. Daisy stood. She moved between the crates and Officer Miller in one smooth motion, her body forming a quiet barrier. She did not bare her teeth. She did not block aggressively. She simply placed herself there. Solid, calm, unmistakable. Her hum deepened. Within seconds, Ranger's cry faltered. Ash's breathing slowed. Piper relaxed, her chest rising and falling more evenly. The room settled again. Officer Miller stared at Daisy, then at the kittens. "I've been doing this a long time," he said slowly. "And I've never seen that." Emily seized the moment. "Neither have I," she said. "But it's happening, and it's working." Miller's jaw tightened. Working doesn't mean allowed. He straightened, stepping back. "Dr. Carter, I can't ignore protocol. If this situation continues without formal authorization, I'll have to order the immediate removal of the dog from the quarantine area." The words landed like a blow. Emily felt Noah tense beside her. "If you remove her," Emily said carefully, "you'll likely destabilize them, especially the smallest." Miller's gaze softened just a fraction. "My responsibility is to the long-term welfare of these animals," he said, "not short-term comfort." Emily held his eyes. "And mine is to keep them alive." Silence stretched between them. Miller looked once more at the kittens, at the way Ash pressed closer to Daisy's side, at Ranger's eyes fixed on the dog with quiet trust, at Piper's fragile but steady breathing. "I'll give you time," he said finally, "but not much. Document everything. This arrangement can't be permanent." He turned and left without another word. The door closed softly behind him. Emily sagged slightly, the weight of the encounter settling into her bones. Noah let out a slow breath. "That was too close," he said. Emily nodded. "And it's not over." She looked at Daisy. The dog had returned to her spot, her body relaxed but alert, her eyes still following the door Officer Miller had exited through. Ranger reached through the crate again, his paw brushing the air where Daisy lay. Ash leaned against the mesh. Piper slept. Emily knelt beside Daisy and placed a gentle hand on her thick fur. "We're going to have to be careful," she murmured, "because the world out there doesn't understand what you're doing." Daisy didn't look at her. She was too busy watching over her babies. And for the first time since the crisis began, Emily felt a quiet fear settle in her chest, not of what Daisy might do, but of what might be taken away, because the outside world had noticed, and it was not always kind to miracles. The days that followed felt borrowed, as if time itself had agreed to slow down out of kindness. With Officer Miller gone, for now, the quarantine room settled into a fragile rhythm. Emily adjusted schedules so the kittens could be monitored without constant disruption. Noah volunteered for extra shifts, finding excuses to linger nearby, his camera often forgotten in his hands. And Daisy never left. The crates were opened during supervised hours, just enough to allow careful interaction. Ranger was the first to venture out. He tumbled clumsily onto the padded floor, shook himself once, and then, without hesitation, began climbing Daisy as if she were a small mountain placed there just for him. His tiny claws dug into her thick fur as he scrambled upward, determined and fearless. Daisy froze. Her entire body went still, muscles locked, not with fear, but with concentration. She turned her head slowly, watching Ranger's progress with an expression that bordered on disbelief. When he reached her shoulder and pressed his small forehead against her neck, Daisy's tail began to move. Slow at first, then with growing confidence. Emily laughed softly from the doorway. "Well," she murmured, "I guess that answers that." Piper followed next, her steps cautious but curious. She discovered Daisy's tail almost immediately, a massive, fluffy appendage that moved just enough to catch her attention. Piper crouched low, her small body tensing, then pounced with all the seriousness of a seasoned hunter. Daisy responded by flicking her tail slightly, just enough to make the game interesting. Ash stayed back at first, watching. When he finally emerged, he moved straight to Daisy's side and pressed himself against her ear, kneading gently with his paws. He began to groom her fur with small, careful licks, his purr deep and steady. Daisy closed her eyes, leaning into the sensation, her breathing slowing as if she were absorbing comfort as much as giving it. Each kitten found their own way to belong. Emily documented the changes carefully. Weight gain, improved vitals, reduced stress behaviors. Piper's temperature stabilized completely. Ranger's cries vanished altogether. Ash began to explore instead of hide. And Daisy changed too. She ate with renewed appetite, her once reserved posture giving way to something lighter. There was a new energy in her movements, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She followed the kittens everywhere, adjusting her pace to match theirs, her large body always angled to protect without crowding. But beneath the joy, something else was growing. The kittens began to hunt. It started small, a moth fluttering near the window, a stray beetle on the floor. Ranger was the first to catch something, a mouse that had slipped in through an unseen gap. He pounced with startling efficiency, his movements fast and precise. Daisy watched, her head tilted, her ears flicked. Confusion crossed her face as Ranger dispatched the mouse and began to eat it with focused intensity. Noah laughed quietly. "I think she's realizing her puppies are not puppies." Daisy's solution came quickly. From that moment on, whenever the kittens practiced their hunting skills, Daisy positioned herself nearby. She didn't interfere. She didn't scold. She simply supervised, her eyes tracking every movement, her body ready to step in if needed. One afternoon, Piper caught a mouse nearly as large as she was. Proud of her accomplishment, she trotted straight toward Daisy, chirping excitedly. Daisy yawned at exactly the wrong moment. Piper dropped the mouse directly into Daisy's open mouth. The reaction was immediate and unforgettable. Daisy's eyes widened, her body went rigid. She froze, then very carefully spat the mouse out onto the floor, her expression a perfect mixture of horror and maternal restraint. Piper rubbed against her leg affectionately, purring as if she had just offered the greatest gift imaginable. Emily had to sit down, laughing through tears. From then on, Daisy learned to keep her mouth firmly closed during hunting hour. As the weeks passed, the kittens grew stronger. Ranger's legs lengthened, muscle replacing softness. Piper's movements became sharp and confident. Ash's quiet nature transformed into focused awareness. They still slept curled against Daisy's side, still greeted her with head bumps and purrs, but something fundamental was shifting. They began to look beyond her. Emily noticed it first, the way Ranger lingered by the window, staring at the trees beyond the glass, the way Piper's ears twitched at distant sounds, the way Ash paused mid-grooming to listen to something only he could hear. One crisp morning, Ranger released a sound Daisy had never heard before. It wasn't a meow, it wasn't a purr, it was deeper, rougher. A call shaped by instinct rather than comfort. Daisy's head snapped up. She followed Ranger's gaze to the far edge of the property, where the forest rose dark and quiet against the sky. Somewhere beyond the trees, something had answered him. A presence felt more than seen. Daisy stood slowly. Emily watched from the doorway, her chest tightening. She knew that sound. She had waited for it, and she had dreaded it. That night, Daisy lay awake long after the kittens fell asleep. She watched them carefully, memorizing the rise and fall of their chests, the warmth of their bodies pressed against hers. When Ranger shifted closer, Daisy rested her chin gently against his back. When Piper twitched in her sleep, Daisy adjusted her position to keep her warm. When Ash stirred, Daisy hummed softly until he settled again. But her eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the forest. Emily saw it when she checked the cameras later, a look she recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who understood that love, at its deepest, asked for something painful in return. The happiest days were still unfolding, but the shadow of what came next had already arrived, and Daisy, who had once been abandoned and broken, was quietly preparing to do the hardest thing she had ever done. Let go. The change did not come all at once. It arrived quietly, folded into the ordinary moments, easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Daisy noticed it first. She always did. Ranger no longer rushed to her side the moment he woke. He still greeted her, brushing past her chest with a quick head bump, but then his attention drifted elsewhere, to the corners of the enclosure, to the shifting shadows beyond the fence, to the distant calls that floated in from the forest at dawn. Piper spent longer stretches practicing her pounces alone, her movements sharp and focused, less playful now and more deliberate. Ash lingered near Daisy the longest, but even he paused more often, his ears flicking toward sounds that carried meanings Daisy could not hear. They were growing up. Dr. Emily Carter saw it too, though she pretended not to at first. She adjusted feeding schedules, expanded the enrichment space, and moved the family into a larger outdoor enclosure designed to mimic natural terrain. It was the right thing to do. She had always known it would come to this. Still, knowing did not make it easier. The first real test came on a cold October morning when Ranger stood at the edge of the enclosure and released a call that echoed across the property. It was not the cry of a frightened kitten. It was the voice of something older, stronger, something answering a pull written into his bones. Daisy lifted her head sharply. She followed Ranger's gaze to the tree line, where a wild bobcat moved silently between the trunks. The animal paused just long enough to mark her territory, then disappeared into the forest as if she had never been there at all. Ranger's body vibrated with excitement. Daisy understood then, with an aching clarity, that her babies were no longer only hers. That evening, she began to change how she mothered them. With Ranger, she initiated a gentle wrestling match, something she had never done before. She lowered herself deliberately, allowing him to climb, push, and finally pin her shoulder to the ground. When he succeeded, Daisy did not rise immediately. She stayed still, acknowledging his strength, his readiness. Ranger stepped back, chest puffed, eyes bright with pride. With Piper, Daisy turned play into training. She darted away, just fast enough to challenge her, then doubled back, encouraging Piper to use every skill she had learned. When Piper finally managed to tackle Daisy's massive front leg, Daisy rolled onto her side in surrender. Piper stood over her, tail flicking, triumphant. Ash's lesson was quieter. One afternoon, Daisy lay beside him in the sun and groomed him slowly, carefully, her tongue smoothing his fur with deliberate attention. Ash purred deeply, leaning into her chest, his small body fitting perfectly beneath her chin. It felt like goodbye. Emily watched these moments with tears she no longer tried to hide. "She's teaching them," she whispered to Noah one evening, "not to need her." The decision was made soon after. A suitable release site had been identified, 15 miles from the center, deep within protected forest, rich with prey and free from competing bobcat families. Ranger, Piper, and Ash would be released together, giving them the best chance to establish themselves as a unit. The night before the release, Daisy did not sleep. She lay awake beside them, her body curved protectively around their sleeping forms. She memorized the weight of them, the sound of their breathing, the way Piper's paw twitched in her dreams, the way Ash pressed closer when the wind shifted, the way Ranger slept stretched out and unafraid. At dawn, the transport crates were prepared. Daisy watched silently as Emily and Noah worked, her posture calm, but her eyes following every movement. When the kittens were guided gently into the crates, Daisy did not intervene. She stood close, steady, her presence a quiet reassurance rather than a barrier. The drive to the release site was long and quiet. Daisy rode in the back seat beside Emily, her head resting against the window. Every time the truck slowed, Daisy lifted her head and looked back toward the crates, counting, making sure. At the clearing, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The forest stretched wide and open, alive with unseen movement. Emily opened the first crate and stepped back. Ranger emerged slowly. He paused at the opening, his body tense, his senses drinking in the world. Then he turned. He walked straight to Daisy and pressed his head firmly against her chest, holding the contact for a long, silent moment. Daisy lowered her head, resting it against his back, breathing him in. Then Ranger turned away. He walked into the forest without looking back. Piper came next. She bounded out with excitement, circled Daisy once, and rose onto her hind legs to touch noses. Daisy's tail wagged just once. Piper chirped softly and vanished after her brother. Ash lingered. He stayed pressed against Daisy's side, his body trembling, torn between comfort and calling. Daisy nudged him gently toward the trees. Ash took a step, then another, looking back each time until the forest closed around him. Daisy stood very still. For a long time, no one moved. Then Daisy turned away from the trees and walked back to Emily, pressing her large body against the woman's legs. Emily knelt and wrapped her arms around Daisy's neck, her tears falling freely now. "I know," she whispered. "I know." As they drove back to the center, the truck felt emptier than it had any right to. Daisy stared out the window, quiet, composed, her strength holding even as something deep inside her cracked. She had done what love required, and it had broken her heart. The quiet that followed the release was heavier than any noise that had come before it. Back at Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center, Daisy moved through the grounds as if she were walking through a memory, rather than a place. She visited the outdoor enclosure where the kittens had learned to stalk and pounce, then the shaded corner where Ash had liked to nap in the afternoons. At night, she returned to the nursery building and lay down in the exact spot where she had once curled her body around 3 small sleeping forms. But the space beside her stayed empty. Daisy ate little. Her movements slowed. She no longer followed Emily from room to room, no longer lifted her head at every distant sound. Instead, she spent long hours staring toward the tree line, her gaze fixed on the forest, as if willing it to give something back. Emily noticed the change immediately. "She's grieving," she told Noah one evening as they watched Daisy from the office window. "Just like any mother would." Noah nodded, his voice quiet. I didn't think it would hit her this hard. Emily swallowed. Neither did I, and that's on me. For 3 days, the center went about its work gently, carefully, as though the air itself might break if disturbed. Staff members spoke in softer voices. Daisy was given space but never ignored. Emily sat with her often, resting a hand on her thick fur, offering presence without expectation. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Emily arrived just before dawn, the sky still deep blue above the mountains. As she pulled into the gravel lot, she noticed Daisy sitting upright near the intake area, her posture alert in a way Emily hadn't seen since before the release. "What are you doing up so early, girl?" Emily murmured as she stepped out of the truck. Daisy didn't look at her. She was staring at a transport crate. Emily froze. The crate hadn't been there when she'd left the night before. Noah appeared from the building, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "They came in around 3 this morning," he said quietly. 2 bobcat kittens. Mother was killed in a snare trap not far from here. Emily's heart clenched. Inside the crate, 2 tiny forms huddled together, their cries thin and exhausted. They sounded achingly familiar. Daisy stood up. She walked forward slowly, her steps measured, her head low. She stopped just short of the crate and sat down, her body aligning instinctively, creating the same calm presence she had once offered 3 other frightened babies. The cries softened. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. Before she could speak, another vehicle pulled into the lot. Officer Grant Miller stepped out, his expression serious. He paused when he saw the scene unfolding in front of him. Daisy. The crate. The quieting cries. He approached slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. "I reviewed the footage," he said to Emily after a moment. "All of it." Emily stiffened. "And," Miller exhaled, "and I owe you an apology." He looked at Daisy again, something gentler settling into his features. "I've spent my career enforcing rules meant to protect wildlife. I still believe in those rules, but I also believe in evidence." He gestured toward the crate. "You have my approval, on one condition." Emily nodded. "Anything. These kittens are to be raised with the same end goal as the others," Miller said. "Release. No exceptions." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. "Of course." Daisy hummed softly, as if she already understood. The weeks that followed felt different from the first time, not lighter, but deeper. Daisy did not try to replace what she had lost. She didn't mother the new kittens out of desperation or loneliness. She did it with a quiet confidence born of experience. She knew now how to guide without clinging, how to comfort without holding too tightly. Emily often thought of Ranger, Piper, and Ash. And 6 months later, confirmation came. Trail cameras placed near the release site captured images that made Emily sit down and cry. 3 bobcats, healthy and strong, moving through the forest with ease. One image showed them grooming one another in a tight cluster, their body language unmistakable. They were wild, and they were bonded. "They're thriving," Noah whispered as he watched over Emily's shoulder. "All of them." Emily smiled through her tears. Because they were loved. Daisy never saw the footage, but Emily liked to believe she knew. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, Daisy would lift her head and look toward the forest. Her tail would wag just once. Small, restrained, peaceful. There was no longing in her eyes anymore. Only understanding. Daisy continued her work at the center for years, mothering one orphaned animal after another, bobcats, foxes, even wolf pups. Each one took a piece of her heart, and each time her heart grew larger to make room. She had learned something profound. Love did not leave her when she let go. It multiplied. Every life she helped heal added strength to her own. Every goodbye carried meaning, not loss. And the broken dog who had once cried alone in the snow had become something extraordinary, not despite her past, but because of it. In giving comfort, Daisy found peace. And in that peace, she proved a quiet, enduring truth. The love we give never disappears. It simply travels on, carried forward into lives we have changed, into futures we may never see, making the world gentler, one small heart at a time.